Why did Genghis Khan's army use psychological warfare? He was a great strategist, founder of the Mongol Empire, and knew how to use the power of psychological warfare. Of course, if anything at all helped him in conquering large territories and holding control over them for so long, then that was his astute use of psychological tactics. Why did Genghis Khan's army use psychological warfare? Here's a detailed look at why and how Genghis Khan's army used psychological warfare. One of the primary purposes Genghis Khan waged psychological warfare was to induce fear in the heart of his opponents. Tales of ruthlessness and brutality far spread as a reputation that preceded the Mongols, thus creating the frequent effect of making cities and armies surrender without a fight, for they were too scared to resist. The Mongol army was effective in deceiving the enemies to puzzle and demoralize them. They would provide misinformation about their force and movements, which would create strategic errors on the enemy's side. For example, the Mongols had often lit several fires in the camp to give the impression of a large force. Another vital aspect of Mongol psychological warfare was the element of surprise. The light cavalrymen of Genghis Khan were known to burst into attacks unexpectedly, always catching their enemies off guard. It was difficult for enemies to mount an effective defense against such an opponent. The Mongols were good at propaganda. They devised stories of their invincibility and the uselessness of resistance. Often they released prisoners to become the propagandists of their tales, so with every success, they acquired the position of an unconquerable force. The Mongols would occasionally inflict brutal punishment on people who resisted them to enhance their fearsome reputation. Indeed, these were warnings to the others about what would happen in case of defiance. Indeed, very destructive were the wholesale destruction of entire cities and the massacre of their inhabitants, serving clear warnings. Genghis Khan also used psychological methods to mislead friends and enemies alike. He allied himself with some groups, only to turn on them at a later period when it was most advantageous. This unpredictability kept potential rivals off guard and constantly wondering at his true intentions. The Mongols were effective in exploiting cultural differences among their enemies. This they would do by utilizing enemy customs and beliefs to their advantage to sow confusion and division within enemy ranks. For example, sometimes they captured enemy soldiers and used them as human shields, knowing that their opponents would not wish to kill their own. Genghis Khan himself was important in terms of his psychological solidity and powerful leadership. He inspired his soldiers, even in the most difficult cases of hardship, to win. As such, his army remained and moved as one block, thereby avoiding chances of internal breakage. This inner psychic energy was as necessary as the external tactics used against enemies. The Mongols respected intellect and espionage. Inherent in the future, enemies would be the gathering of their strength, weaknesses, and plans. It was this knowledge that gave them the basis to exploit weaknesses and build psychological pressure on their opponents. On the final count, it has to be said that the reason the Mongols succeeded so remarkably well at psychological warfare was because of their adaptability and innovativeness in the deployment of these tactics. They did not stay bound to the conventional ways of prosecuting a war, with their eyes set on new ways to outsmart and outmaneuver their enemies. Genghis Khan applied a multi-dimensional approach to his psychological warfare, which was based on fear, deception, surprise, propaganda, and psychological manipulation. It is these tactics that enabled him to establish and hold together one of the most gigantic empires in world history. Most of Genghis Khan's enemies were defeated before the battle ever began, because he understood and exploited the psychological dimensions of warfare.